July 1st, 2023, Daytona Beach, Florida. Body camera footage shows a woman in handcuffs doing something absolutely bizarre. She's pouring Diet Mountain Dew all over herself. Officers think she's having a mental breakdown. What they don't realize yet is that she's trying to destroy DNA evidence from a murder so brutal it will haunt seasoned investigators. What preceded this moment will leave you in shock. But what happens next will make you question everything you think you know about crime, justice, and the terrifying gap between sanity and madness. If you're ready for a case that will challenge every assumption you have about criminal behavior, hit that like button, subscribe for investigations that go deeper than headlines, and comment with the city you're watching from. Because what you're about to discover about this Daytona Beach murder will stay with you long after this video ends.
I need something to drink.
I got a Diet Mountain Dew.
Please, yes.
Will you sit
Yes.
in my car?
Yes.
Promise?
Please, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
If I give her a Diet Mountain Dew, she'll sit in my car.
Thanks. Can you open that, please? Thanks. Good.
One more drink. Yeah, one more. All right, let me have the can now.
They don't taste like that. Hold on.
Okay,
I'm not
that's
done,
fine.
ma'am.
You said one
I'm
more
not
drink.
done.
No,
I'm not
I
done.
Nicole, don't let me fucking drunk.
I ain't doing shit.
Oh, she's doing that.
What? Yep. Whatever.
Oh, we got charges. Trying to get rid of evidence.
Woman pouring soda on herself is 35-year-old Nicole Maks. In the past 24 hours, her world has completely unraveled. But the real question isn't what she did. It's whether she was even living in the same reality as the rest of us when she did it. And that question will take us down a rabbit hole so dark, so complex, that by the end, you'll understand why this case represents everything wrong with how America treats its most vulnerable citizens. But first, we need to go back to where it all began. A house fire that revealed much more than anyone expected. 1:46 a.m., July 1st, 2023. Firefighters respond to what seems like a routine house fire on Clark Street in Daytona Beach. Routine, until they get inside and discover something that immediately transforms this from a fire call to a homicide investigation. In an upstairs bedroom, they find a man's body. The victim appears to be elderly, face down, clearly deceased. But this wasn't death by smoke inhalation or burns. This was something much more violent, much more personal. What the firefighters couldn't know in that moment was that they were looking at the end result of a perfect storm. Mental illness, system failure, and trauma so severe it had created a walking time bomb that had finally exploded. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because before we can understand what happened in that bedroom, we need to understand the two people whose lives intersected in the most tragic way possible. The victim was 79-year-old Michael Cerasoli. But who was he really? What kind of man ends up sharing his home with someone who would ultimately kill him? And what warning signs might everyone have missed? Those answers are coming, but first, let's follow the investigation as it unfolds. Because what detectives discovered in the hours after finding Cerasoli's body would lead them to someone whose behavior was so bizarre, so disconnected from reality, that it would force everyone involved to question the very nature of criminal responsibility. The search for suspects didn't take long. Just hours after Cerasoli's body was discovered, at approximately 3:30 a.m. on July 2nd, a detective in nearby Holly Hill encountered something that immediately raised red flags. A woman walking near a restaurant, barefoot, bleeding, carrying what appeared to be weapons. When approached, she immediately dropped a knife and hammer. Her timing was suspicious. Found with weapons just hours after a brutal murder in the same county. Her appearance was disturbing, bloody, disheveled, clearly in distress. Her name was Nicole Maks, and what she told police next would begin one of the most psychologically complex interrogations in recent Florida history. But before we reveal what she told police, and trust me, you won't believe it, let's examine what forensic evidence was telling investigators about what had actually happened in Michael Cerasoli's bedroom, because the physical evidence was about to paint a picture so violent, so sustained, that it would make Maks' later explanations even more impossible to reconcile with reality.
Coming up, the forensic evidence that would prove Nicole Maks killed Michael Cerasoli, and the bizarre story she told police that would make everyone question whether she understood what she had done. But first, we need to understand who Michael Cerasoli was and why his decision to help a troubled younger woman would ultimately cost him his life. Michael Cerasoli was 79 years old, living alone on Clark Street in a house that had probably been his home for decades. At his age, on a fixed income, every financial decision mattered. Utilities, groceries, property taxes, the math of survival gets harder every year when your income is static, but your expenses keep climbing. Somewhere along the way, Michael made a decision that probably seemed practical and kind. He would take in a roommate, someone younger who needed affordable housing, someone he could help while also helping himself manage expenses. That roommate was Nicole Maks. We don't know exactly how they met or what convinced Michael to offer her a place to stay. What we know is that at some point, an elderly man made the choice to share his home with a woman less than half his age who was struggling with circumstances that would later prove deadly. Maybe he saw someone who needed help and felt compelled to offer it. Maybe the extra income made the difference between comfort and financial stress. Maybe he appreciated having someone else in the house, someone to talk to occasionally, someone to share the space that might have felt too large for one person. Whatever his reasons, Michael Cerasoli's decision to help Nicole Maks was an act of basic human decency, the kind that makes communities work. Neighbors helping neighbors, people looking out for each other. He had no way of knowing he was living with a psychological time bomb that was about to explode. Because Nicole Maks wasn't just struggling with housing insecurity or financial problems. She was carrying trauma so severe it had fractured her grip on reality, mental illness so profound it distorted her perception of the world around her, and a history of system failures so complete that she'd learned to expect abandonment rather than help. The combination would prove lethal, but we're not there yet. The night of June 30th into July 1st was, by all accounts, ordinary until it wasn't. Michael went to bed in his upstairs bedroom sometime before midnight, probably following the same routine he'd maintained for years. Nicole was elsewhere in the house, probably struggling with the kind of insomnia that often accompanies severe mental illness. What happened next would transform both their lives forever, though only one would survive to tell the story. And the story she would tell would reveal a mind operating in a reality completely separate from the one the rest of us inhabit. But before we get to Nicole's explanation for what happened that night, and I promise you won't believe it, let's examine what forensic evidence revealed about the violence that occurred in Michael Cerasoli's bedroom. The crime scene told a story that was clear and horrifying. Blood spatter analysis revealed sustained, close-contact violence. Multiple stab wounds indicated repeated attacks. Blunt force trauma to the head suggested the use of additional weapons. The position of the body showed Michael had been face down when the violence ended. This wasn't a single moment of rage or a struggle that got out of hand. This was sustained, brutal violence that continued long after the victim was incapacitated. The kind of attack that suggests either extreme rage or complete psychological breakdown. Near the body, investigators found a blood-soaked knife. 2 cell phones were present, one belonging to Michael, one to his killer. The weapon would soon reveal DNA evidence that would confirm what the timeline already suggested. But the forensic evidence, damning as it was, couldn't answer the most important question. What could possibly drive someone to commit such violence against the person who had given them shelter?
Thirsty or trying to
That
calm
answer
down,
would come from
brought her
Nicole
a
Maks
can.
herself, and
What
it would be
happened
so
next would
bizarre,
be captured
so
on body
disconnected
camera
from
footage
reality
that
it would
investigators
force
still
everyone
struggle
involved to
to explain.
reconsider everything they thought
Nicole
they
Maks
knew about
didn't
crime
drink the soda.
and criminal responsibility.
Instead, she opened the can and began pouring the entire contents over her body and hair, soaking herself completely while handcuffed. Officers watched in amazement as she methodically covered every inch of exposed skin, working the sticky liquid through her hair, treating the bizarre task with the kind of focus usually reserved for life-or-death situations. Which, in her fractured reality, it probably was. Watch the footage carefully. This isn't the behavior of someone trying to outsmart police through calculated evidence destruction. This is someone who genuinely believes she's found a solution to an urgent problem. Her concentration, her methodical approach, her apparent confidence in the effectiveness of her actions, all of it suggests a mind operating according to rules and logic that exist nowhere but in her own consciousness. The question that would haunt this case from that moment forward was both simple and profound. Did Nicole Maks actually believe Diet Mountain Dew could destroy DNA evidence, or was this evidence of a complete psychological break from reality? The answer would redefine everything about how we understand this case, criminal responsibility, and the intersection of mental illness with violent crime. But to understand that answer, we need to dive deeper into who Nicole Maks really was and what had happened to her mind long before she ever met Michael Cerasoli. Because what investigators were about to discover would force them to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the people who commit the most shocking crimes are themselves victims of tragedy so profound they've lost the ability to distinguish between what's real and what's not. Coming up, the forensic evidence that would prove Nicole Maks killed Michael Cerasoli and the shocking background that would explain how someone's reality can become so distorted that murder seems logical, while Diet Mountain Dew seems like a reasonable defense strategy. But first, let's examine what the physical evidence revealed about the last moments of Michael Cerasoli's life. The forensic analysis was devastating in its clarity and horrifying in its implications. The knife found near Cerasoli's body contained his DNA on the blade and Maks's DNA on the handle. Her fingerprints were on the weapon. Blood spatter analysis confirmed not just violence, but sustained, repeated attacks. The evidence painted a picture that was hard to reconcile with the woman who thought carbonated beverages destroy forensic evidence. This wasn't random violence or momentary rage. The forensic experts described a pattern of attacks that suggested either calculated brutality or complete psychological breakdown. Multiple stab wounds, blunt force trauma from what appeared to be a hammer, evidence of struggle that had continued long after the victim was incapacitated. The bedroom wasn't just a crime scene, it was a battlefield where an older man had fought for his life and lost. How does someone commit violence this sustained and brutal, then hours later genuinely believe that Diet Mountain Dew will eliminate the evidence? How does the same mind that plans and executes a complex murder also convince itself that feeding spiders at 2 a.m. is a reasonable explanation for being at the crime scene? The answer lies in understanding what trauma and mental illness can do to a human consciousness, and how society's failure to address these issues creates walking time bombs that inevitably explode in the most tragic ways possible. Because what investigators discovered about Nicole Maks' background would reframe everything they thought they understood about this crime and force uncomfortable questions about who bears responsibility when systems fail so completely that tragedy becomes inevitable. Coming up, the legal battle that would force prosecutors to confront an impossible question. How do you prove premeditated murder when the defendant might not have been living in the same reality as the rest of us? And the shocking plea deal that would satisfy no one but might represent the best justice possible in an impossible situation. The prosecution of Nicole Maks presented challenges that extended beyond typical murder cases. Initially charged with first-degree premeditated murder, prosecutors faced a fundamental problem. How do you prove someone planned a crime when that same person believes Diet Mountain Dew destroys DNA evidence and claims she killed someone while feeding imaginary spiders? Premeditation requires intent, planning, deliberation, concepts that become meaningless when applied to someone whose mind operates according to rules that exist nowhere but in their own fractured consciousness. The evidence of guilt was overwhelming. DNA, fingerprints, timeline, weapons, opportunity, everything pointed to Nicole Maks as the killer. But proving she killed Michael Cerasoli was different from proving she murdered him with the kind of calculated intent required for first-degree charges. Because the same mind that committed this brutal violence was also the mind that thought feeding spiders was a reasonable explanation and carbonated beverages were forensic countermeasures. These weren't the thoughts of someone capable of the kind of rational planning required for premeditated murder charges. The legal system found itself grappling with questions that challenge our entire framework for understanding crime and punishment. Is someone responsible for actions they commit while experiencing psychotic episodes? How do we balance accountability for violence with recognition of severe mental illness? What does justice look like when everyone involved has been failed by systems meant to protect them? These questions would ultimately force a plea agreement that satisfied no one completely, but might represent the best possible outcome in an impossible situation. But before we get to that resolution, we need to understand how someone's mind can become so fractured that murder seems logical, while their attempts to cover it up seem insane. In November 2023, facing overwhelming evidence and complex questions about mental capacity, Nicole Maks entered a plea agreement that would redefine how we think about this case. She pled no contest to a reduced charge of second-degree murder instead of first-degree, acknowledging the violence while implicitly recognizing that premeditation might not apply to someone experiencing psychotic episodes. She also pled no contest to arson, evidence tampering, and resisting arrest with violence. The plea agreement represented something unprecedented, a legal system's acknowledgement that traditional concepts of criminal intent might not apply when the defendant's reality doesn't align with the one that the rest of us share. But accepting this plea raised even more disturbing questions. If Nicole Maks wasn't fully responsible for her actions due to mental illness, who was? If trauma and system failure created the conditions for this tragedy, what does accountability mean? If we can understand how this happened, why do we continue allowing it to happen? The answers would emerge during the sentencing phase, when two competing narratives about responsibility, justice, and society's obligations would force everyone involved to confront truths they'd rather ignore. During sentencing hearings, the full scope of Nicole Maks' psychological damage was finally revealed. A defense psychiatrist testified about trauma so severe it had literally rewired her brain. Mental illness so profound it distorted her perception of everything around her. The sex trafficking, the childhood sexual abuse, the complex PTSD, the schizoaffective disorder, the substance use that represented desperate self-medication when proper psychiatric treatment wasn't available or accessible. But clinical explanations can't bring Michael Cerasoli back to life. Understanding causes doesn't undo consequences. Empathy for mental illness doesn't eliminate accountability for violence. The judge faced an impossible calculation, weighing Cerasoli's death against Maks's lifetime of victimization, balancing public safety against mental health considerations, trying to find justice in a situation where everyone involved had been failed by the systems meant to protect them.
On February 28, 2025, Nicole Maks was sentenced to 35 years in prison, the minimum sentence allowable under her plea agreement. She will likely die behind bars for actions she committed while her mind existed in a reality none of us can fully comprehend. Whether this represents justice or simply another tragedy in a series of tragedies depends on how you define justice, accountability, and society's responsibility to its most vulnerable members. But here's what should terrify all of us about this sentence. It does absolutely nothing to address the conditions that created this tragedy in the first place. Right now, in communities across America, there are other Nicole Maks struggling with severe mental illness and trauma without adequate support. There are other Michael Cerasolis housing vulnerable people because our social safety nets are inadequate. There are other preventable tragedies being created by our collective failure to provide treatment before crisis, support before breakdown, intervention before violence. The Mountain Dew moment that began this story isn't just evidence of one woman's psychological break. It's a symbol of the gap between what we expect from people and what they're capable of delivering when every system meant to help them has failed. It represents our collective failure to build mental health services that actually serve the mentally ill, social safety nets that actually catch people before they fall, trauma treatment that actually prevents trauma from creating new victims. Consider this. Nicole Maks's history of trafficking and abuse was known to various agencies. Her mental illness was diagnosed. Her need for intensive support was documented. Yet somehow, she ended up living independently with minimal oversight, sharing a house with an elderly man who had no training in crisis management and no warning about the danger he was living with. Every step of this tragedy was predictable. Every warning sign was visible. Every intervention point was missed. And when the inevitable crisis finally occurred, we responded with handcuffs and prison sentences instead of asking how we could have prevented it. The spider feeding story isn't just evidence of psychotic delusion. It's evidence of a mind so abandoned by support systems that it created its own reality, complete with responsibilities that existed nowhere but in Nicole Maks's fractured consciousness. The Diet Mountain Dew wasn't just an attempt to destroy evidence. It was the desperate act of someone whose understanding of the world had become so detached from shared reality that carbonated beverages seemed like reasonable forensic countermeasures. These behaviors aren't just symptoms of mental illness. They're symptoms of social abandonment so complete that the person experiencing it had to construct an alternative reality just to survive psychologically. And when that alternative reality collided with the shared reality the rest of us inhabit, an innocent man died and a deeply damaged woman became a killer. The body camera footage of Nicole Maks pouring Diet Mountain Dew over herself will remain forever as evidence in a murder case, but it should serve as something more, a reminder that behind every inexplicable crime is a human story of trauma, illness, and system failure. It should challenge us to build better mental health services, stronger social safety nets, and more comprehensive support for trauma survivors. It should force us to ask not just how do we punish people who commit crimes while mentally ill, but how do we prevent people from becoming so mentally ill that they commit crimes? Because somewhere in your community right now, there's another Nicole Maks struggling without adequate support. There's another Michael Cerasoli trying to help someone who might be dangerous. There's another tragedy waiting to unfold unless we choose to intervene with compassion, wisdom, and resources before crisis occurs. The Diet Mountain Dew defense reveals everything wrong with how we handle mental illness, trauma, and violence in America. We wait for crisis instead of providing prevention. We respond with punishment instead of treatment. We create the very problems we then claim to be shocked by. This case should haunt all of us, not because of the violence, but because it was preventable. If you believe we can do better, if you think stories like this should drive change instead of just entertainment, share this video. Comment with one thing your community could do differently to prevent tragedies like this one. And subscribe because we're going to keep investigating the cases that demand more than just our attention. They demand our action. Michael Cerasoli can't be brought back. Nicole Maks can't undo what she did. But we can honor both their stories by working to prevent others like them. We can build the kind of society where fewer of these tragedies occur, where vulnerable people get help before they become dangerous, where acts of kindness don't result in violence. The conversation starts here, but it continues in your communities, your votes, and your choices about what kind of society we want to build. Make sure you're part of it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.